Hey, now it's time for us to start discussing the Czech perk. A very interesting sideline, and in my opinion, an opening that clearly deserves a lot more attention than it gets. And, well, the position arises after such moves as e4, d6, d4, knight f6, knight c3. And here, as you know, the normal perk would run g6, while the Philidor starts after the move e5. But in fact, there is another move in this position as well, which I think is very interesting, namely the move pawn to c6. So let's talk a little bit about the ideas, and let's try to understand why do we want to play in this way. Well, here's the deal. For one, let's look at, for example, the perk for a second, normal proper perk. Here, White has a bunch of continuations. The thing is, White can choose what type of position he wants to get. If he wishes, he can play very calmly, knight f3, bishop e2, castling, and so on. If he likes to, he can go f4 and go for the three-pawn attack, Austrian attack. If he wants to, he can play f3 and then bishop e3, queen d2, long castling, and try to checkmate black along the way. White can also choose some other sidelines, such as he can play g3, which is what Karpov used to like a lot. And there's a very famous game between Karpov and Timman, which I strongly suggest you just study in case if you haven't yet. But generally, the issue is that White has way too many continuations. Now, as for the Philidor, in fact, I have a lot of respect for this opening from the philosophical perspective, so to speak. Yeah, however, again, White has quite a lot of possibilities. He can make it to the endgame. He can go for the middle game with knight f3. He can try to play, for example, knight e2 and then g3, bishop g2. He has some other continuations as well. But, yeah, generally, well, White is the one choosing the type of a game. But, in fact, the move c6, well, of course, it has its own disadvantages, and we'll talk about specifics. I'm not, trying to present it to you as if it was the best opening out there, one that would win the game by force or something. Of course not. But it's a very interesting continuation, because, for example, if White goes knight f3, Black can choose to go g6, bishop g7 and play it like perk. Black can choose to go knight d7, e5 and play it like Philidor. And Black can choose to, for example, throw his bishop out on g4, which is exactly what we will be doing. So as you can see, Black has quite a bit of variety. And in fact, White really doesn't have all that many possibilities. Like, White can go knight f3 here, White can go f4, and White can do other stuff such as, say, h3, or like bishop e2, or like, I don't know, bishop e3, but those moves are not particularly threatening, because Black keeps the options open of transposing either to Philidor or to the perk under the favorable terms. So, in my opinion, this opening presents a great deal of flexibility. Now, let's start with the most natural move, in my opinion, which is knight to f3. In fact, the move f4 here is the most popular continuation, but we'll start with the move knight to f3. So here, as I said, Black has a bunch of variety. He can go g6, looking to play the perk. And in fact, interestingly, I don't really think it is that bad at all. In fact, I think it's a very sensible idea, because now, in the perk, White lost possibilities to play f3 and to play f4, which are actually the most dangerous possibilities that White has. So here, well, you can argue that the move c6 was not really particularly needed. However, I see really nothing wrong about just going g6, and for example, after, say, bishop e2, bishop g7, castling, let's say, a4, a normal perk move, well, you just got to play your perk, like queen c7, e5, or like knight d7, and this is something you can toy with. You have the variety, you can try to play around. And yeah, I mean, of course, it's perk, Black is a little worse, there is no doubt about that, but he gets an interesting complicated position, full of pieces, where there is not that much theory, not that much he needs to know, move after move. So it would be a perfect choice for an club player who is just looking to get a game, who is just looking to have fun. But our main focus here will be on and in fact another interesting move, even though that's a little suspicious, is queen a5. But that's just something I wanted to refer to, but not necessarily show you. Here's the main line runs bishop d3, and here black can go e5, black can go bishop g4. Well, e5 is interesting, but generally I'm not such a huge fan of those positions. But the main move I wanted to present to you here is bishop to g4. Now, white really has a plethora of continuations. And in fact, the move knight f3 is something that, in fact, this position, I think, is already something that many players might feel somewhat uncomfortable about, especially if they haven't studied it in a lot of detail, because, as I said, black keeps a ton of, transpositional possibilities. So imagine you go knight f3 as white, and black plays g6, and you're in a perk. And what do you do if you play f4 versus perk, for example? You have a problem. You don't know the rising positions. So, generally speaking, I personally consider the move knight f3 either a very cunning continuation, which is something that only very, savvy players would go for, who actually know how to play precisely move after move, who have, memorized, analyzed some sequences, or it will be played by players who just have no idea about what they're doing. And you'll see what I mean very shortly. So now let's talk about the actual, unique ideas which are typical of the Czech perk. We'll go bishop g4, and I'll start by showing to you what happens if white simply, slacks, so to speak, and plays some moves like, say, bishop e2, or like, a4. Let's say it goes bishop e2. Here, the main idea is to play e6, followed by d5. So basically, we're playing some sort of a French defense, or some sort of a Caro-Kann, with the bishop already outside. And what's interesting is that, for example, if white castles here, and black plays d5, and let's say white goes e5 and black goes knight d7, well, in fact, the position is very similar to Caro-Kann. For example, the classical Caro-Kann arises after such moves as e4, c6, d4, d5, e5, bishop f5, knight f3, e6, bishop e2, for example, knight d7, castling. And as you can see, well, in our position, this knight is on d7, which is a little unusual. Unfortunately now, for some reason, I cannot draw an arrow from this knight on g8 to d7, but you got what I'm talking about. And the bishop's already on g4, and the white knight is instead on c3. So, in fact, in many positions of this sort, well, the knight, for example, doesn't really want to be on c3, because generally, white's ideas might include playing c4 at some point, or they might include playing, for example, say a4, a5, c3, b4, grabbing space, and often the knight goes to d2, either in order to come to b3, or possibly to come to f1 and then to e3, g3, or possibly to support this knight on f3. And when the knight goes to c3, in fact, white loses a ton of, options. So it's not really clear what the knight exactly is doing there, because now white doesn't have any ideas related to the move c4, and the knight doesn't have anywhere to go to. So, in fact, well, of course there's, computer evaluations, there's, like, specific sequences, but I love looking at openings from the perspective of philosophy, like why, what structure are we looking to get? What type of positions are we looking to obtain? What pieces we want to trade? Where our pieces want to be? And sometimes in some openings, everything comes with some disadvantage, like, you're missing a tempo or something, but I think it's super important to understand the philosophy behind some opening. Now, bishop g4, so bishop e2, e6, and here, for example, if white castles, and we go d5, we got this sort of position. And in fact, well, this is, I think, a pretty decent way for white to play. Now he can make quite a lot of decisions. And in fact, I think a pretty uncomfortable thing for most white players is that they'll need to make decisions early on. For example, here, do you want to, let's say, play bishop d3 and get the French structure, Caro structure? Or do you want to play e5 and get some closed, like French Caro structure? Or do you want to take on d5 and get some sort of Carlsbad structure or Caro-Kann exchange structure? A lot of decisions, right? Now, for example, starting with the easiest things, if let's say white takes on d5, okay, you can just take back. For example, cd5. And here, the thing is, well, you have some sort of Caro-Kann or something, but your bishop already got out a very good square. And again, I really love comparisons. And if you compare, for example, this position to the normal Caro-Kann, for example, the exchange Caro-Kann, or let's say queen c7. Sorry, my apologies. if you compare it, for example, to this line, well, here, white doesn't want you to be able to meet knight f3 with bishop g4. So he either goes h3 or he goes knight e2, intending to meet bishop g4 with possibly f3 at some point, and then say knight f4, hunting your bishop on h5 or something. But in our case, as you can see, the bishop has already been able to get out. Now, so e d5 is not a problem, and after c d5, well, again, we can continue, let's make some moves. We can play, for example, knight c6, let's say later bishop d6, castling, and later, for example, let's say white does something, we go bishop d6, let's say chop, chop. Later, the plan could be to go rook to b8, and then b5, b4, a5, and run the so-called pawn minority attack on the queen side. And in fact, such a position is very comfortable for black, not just due to the structure, but actually because the bishop is already outside of the pawn chain. And also this knight is very misplaced. It wants to be on d2, of course, not on c3, so that white can take back with the knight, so that white can play c3, so that maybe the knight can go to b3 and then to c5. So this is, I think, super convenient. And on the other hand, if white is to play e5, well, this is, I think, the more challenging move. Then we go knight d7. And here white again needs to make decisions. So in fact, I would like us to start with the game. And I personally think this is a sort of scenario you're very likely to run into in your games. For example, so this game continued bishop e3. Well, black played c5. Queen d2. Black played. And here, in fact, black missed an opportunity. So I think, or not even missed an opportunity, but I think it makes sense to simply chop off this knight immediately. And after bishop f3, we can just go knight c6. And here, the entire center is already collapsing, and surprisingly, white is nearly lost. Like, for example, if white were to take, well, we just take on c5, let's say takes, takes. And this pawn is super weak now, knight d7 is coming, the pawn's gonna fall. And in fact, having a bishop on f3 in such a position is absolutely terrible for many reasons. Well, for one, the bishop's not particularly useful overall, and secondly, it stops white from playing, let's say, pawn to f4. But white cannot easily fix the problem by going, let's say, bishop e2. Well, I mean, the pawn is hanging in all the lines. And maybe here, black needs to be cautious due to moves like queen e3, hitting knights, or like queen d4. But he can, for example, choose to castle first. And if white tries to play f4 to hold on, then after queen b6, now his position is going to fall apart due to all this sort of discovered attacks, you know, pawns which are hanging and so on. So this is just terrible. So, this really doesn't work for white. And in fact, black chose to continue with the move knight c6, which is also fine. It just lets white kind of fix the situation a little bit. White took here, black took on f3, white took on f3, and black took on e5. And still, this wasn't a good position. I think that white should have, for example, retreated, and after, say, d4, well, I mean, the position collapses, or white could have gone, let's say, queen e2, and here d4 is not so clear, because white can take on c6 or play rook d1, but black could even just continue, like bishop e7, castling. Later, the pawn's gonna be super weak after queen a5 or knight d7. Black has the center to himself completely. White's not in a position to challenge us in the center. So this is super convenient, and black is just much better. So in this game, white ended up playing rook to d1, and then black just took on f3, developed, castled, put the bishop on f6, and as you can see here, black simply dominating the position. The bishop's fantastic, much better than the white knight. The white king, in fact, is quite suspicious. The white structure on the king side has been shattered. Due to the bishop on f6, there's no talking, there's no hope to ever be in a position for white to challenge the pawn on g7 or to attack over the g file. This is not happening. Finally, I mean, the pawn on c5 is also super weak. Rook c8 is coming. Maybe even b6 is coming if needed. Black can even choose to like take on c3 at some point. For example, if say white moved queen e2, I would strongly consider just bishop c3, giving white double pawns here and triple pawns here. And of course, well, this is simply terrible. So, white played queen e3, and here black continued queen c7. He didn't get to win this pawn right away, however, now all the other pawns are falling apart. And after, for example, a3, that's what was played, queen c2, well, black simply ended up, just a pawn up with an overwhelming position, and he converted. Now, you might wonder again, all these games I'm showing to, like, where did I find them, like, what are these games, who are the players? Did I find you a game of, I don't know, some, like, club player who just has no clue how the pieces move, or, I don't know, some, beginner who was shown how to play yesterday? Because clearly white lost, in a very bad way. And I don't really mean to, like, make fun, of course, of the white player or something. I just want to say that, well, knowing the rating of a white player, you would agree that white could play much, much better. This was a very bad day for the white player. In fact, the white player here was rated over 2300 FIDE, a titled player. Well, black was near the 2700. So, as you can see, for one, this opening, well, it clearly isn't, the most bulletproof, the most sound opening in chess compared with Berlin, or compared with Najdorf, or compared even with Caro-Kann or French. However, it's a perfectly viable weapon. White can have a slight advantage maybe if he plays perfectly, but okay, so what? We are playing a game of chess. Now, let's move on. So here, in fact, this is quite a critical position. And in fact, white can try to pose some problems to us if he knows what he is doing. As I promised you, most players will not know what they are doing here. They'll develop the bishop, and then after c5, knight c6, bishop e7, queen b6, we have this very, very standard position, which is kind of, typical French, where the bishop's already outside of the pawn chain, already on g4, as opposed to being all the way back on c8, stuck and unhappy. So here, white can try to pose problems by playing such a direct move as knight g5, for example. And here, we're gonna take, and just play bishop e7 or h6, for example h6. And in fact, in this position, the only game I'm aware of, so the move knight takes on f7, which is of course incorrect. Black can just take back. The only things after taking, black mishandled it. He went king e7, after which white continued bishop g5, takes, and this was a balanced position, where eventually black went on to win pretty fast from now on, but there's no need to give white such a luxury, and in fact black can simply continue with the move king g8, and after, for example, I don't know what white would even do, black can just play knight a6 in order to connect the rook and the queen, and later offer a trade with queen e8. Later, if needed, if white will be advancing here, well, black can go say knight a6. If f5, black can just offer a queen trade. Of course, white cannot accept. We're just gonna take, and just play, for example, knight c7. Well, the knight or the queen are just gonna join the defense. Black will play bishop e7, king h7, rook f8, and this just looks like an extra piece to me. White is gonna lose. This is of course not going to do anything for white. So here, white should continue with the move queen h5, but this is already, I believe, a novelty. Actually, no one even played this way. And here after g6, queen h3, we need to be a little mindful of all the possible sorts of sacrifices, but this is not a problem really. We can just go bishop e7, and here I believe that, well, most players will just decide to go knight f3 or something, and here after c5, black just gets a great position. The center immediately gets under a lot of pressure. So white here should find a move like f4, and he is not really afraid of hanging leaving the knight hanging at any point. But here, I actually see no problems. No sacrifices are really threatened, something we need to worry about. Black can, for example, go queen b6, hit the pawn, taking advantage of the fact that bishop e3 would hang this pawn. So, for example, white will go knight e2, and then black can just go knight a6. And later, in fact, black can choose between several options. He can continue later with a long castling. Of course, he doesn't want to hang the pawn. He'll first deal with that problem. Black can, in fact, continue with short castling. Black can continue with c5. Now, in fact, it's not easy for white to make a move. The knight cannot move due to the pawn. The bishop cannot move due to the pawn in b2. Say if white makes a move like c3, black would go knight c7. For example, if white moves the knight somewhere, black would play c5. And as you can see, this whole deal, this whole thing, didn't really get particularly far. It's not like white had managed to make a tremendous amount of progress. So in fact, after deep analysis, I found something super exciting. Like here, for example, the computer says white can play knight f7 after a lot of analysis, and after taking f5, and after taking e6, and this is now the point is that like if king takes knight f4, and if king f7, knight g6, all the sacrifices continue. And here after say queen d4, eventually it finds some like repetition of moves or a draw. Well, first of all, black doesn't really need to go for it. Black could even go like king e8 and just give up this knight and establish his king on a safe spot, and later go knight c7, knight e6, and black is a pawn up, and his king is perfectly safe. He can just move the rook away and just, you know, hide the king if needed. So this is absolutely okay. And yeah, in fact, there's like a ton of very, very exciting complications I found here, which I was super excited about because, well, it's not really that often that you get to analyze such a fresh and explored positions, like position move 10, move 11, no games in the database, no clue what's happening, and a ton of, you know, interesting complications. So I've had a ton of fun before I've started delivering this material to you, and I'm having some along the way as well, as I imagine you would be quite surprised to see all that as well. So yeah, so here in fact, well, this queen h5 leads to a very interesting position, but black is fine. White can try some other things, like for example go knight e1, or something like this, but then black can simply take, for example c5. And all these natural moves of course lead to a decent position. In fact here, white can try to do something on the king side, by means of say playing knight d3, f4. However, it's important to understand the following defensive resource. For example, after castling f4, it's worth knowing that black can try to play for f5. However, we're not gonna do this here. We're gonna first involve c4 to kick this knight out and possibly prevent it from coming to e5 if needed, at least sometime soon. And after, for example, knight e1, we can play f6, which leads to a very interesting position. Or we can just make the move f5. And I actually think this is a perfectly, you know, reasonable position for black. Imagine if the black bishop was on c8 and say the white bishop was on c2. Well, this bishop could be used for an attack, and this bishop would be absolutely stuck. It would be obstructing the coordination between the pieces, and it would be, of course, clearly, you know, an absolutely redundant piece which black would dream of getting rid of. Now, though, we managed to get rid of the bishop. So now, even though we have a little less space, we don't have a space disadvantage, because, obviously, all the black pieces have very good spots. Later you can choose to play b5, a5, b4, possibly a4, a3, bring your rook over, or maybe just play with this rook and use this one for defense. And in fact, this position, the computer tends to favor white slightly, but I would have personally absolutely no concerns playing it in a practical game, because it clearly feels like black has a ton of counterplay, and the position's super interesting, the position's very fighting. So this is, I think, perfectly okay. Now, moving on. So this position is something we've more or less discussed. Like, white can try to play something else, like h3. Okay, here. I don't think you want to take, actually, because actually there's a very interesting idea here which I found. So one game, so bishop f3, and here it seems natural to go c5, and it looks like the white center is again under pressure. However, somehow black's not very well developed, and white has actually a very interesting idea here. Actually, I would encourage you strongly to stop the video and think what white can do, what sort of ideas come up to mind when you look at it as white. Alrighty, I hope you've taken the time and paused the video. So in fact, a very interesting thing white can throw at black here is the move knight takes on d5. And the thing is, after e d5, bishop d5, white's got 2 pawns for a piece. Now, bishop b7 is a threat, and the bishop's also eyeing down f7, and in fact the black king now is stuck in the center. And for example, after knight c6, a very natural move is queen f3. Now, again, white's threatening this pawn, and mate, and let's say queen e7, chop, chop, chop. It just feels like white is getting too much initiative, and he's already not even any material down, got 3 pawns for a missing piece. So I would strongly suggest you avoid stuff like that, and in fact this pattern is something you need to be aware of. So instead we would simply retreat. And in fact, what's interesting is that even retreating to f5 in the spirit of Caro-Kann makes perfect sense, but also like just going to h5, keeping the pin. And in fact, here it doesn't seem easy for white to play, because we're gonna play c5, knight c6, again, pressures the white center, always ready to take when we're developed. For example, some games would see bishop g5, bishop e7, and here takes, knight e1, and here black can actually, in my opinion, it's instead of taking, which is a very interesting move also, it's very sensible to retreat as well, because in fact, well, how come is this bishop worse than the bishop on e2? And black's already not really lacking any space, he needn't fear anything, and later he can go c5, knight c6, and again, I see this bishop as an excellent piece, and if white tries to play bishop d3 and trade it, black can in fact also invite white to take on g6 with such a move as c5, and he can of course choose to take himself. But it's also fine to take, and play c5, let's say knight c6, f4, and again, here, black has a bunch of options. For example, the standard f5, which we've just talked about, makes perfect sense to me. And if, say, white were to take after knight f6, we have nothing to worry about. Now white has a weak square on e4. And on the other hand, after f5, it's not really clear what white should be doing. Again, we can choose this plan, or we can just play b5, a5, b4, without playing c4, to keep the option of cd4 open. But in fact, we can even simply castle and ignore what white is doing, because let's say here, okay, we're just gonna take this pawn, and after rook f5, we're simply gonna play something like f6, just to end up in a symmetrical position, or more or less symmetrical position, where white has a weak square on e4, where all the black pieces are much more active, so this wouldn't do for white. And we can even choose to castle long here, and possibly later follow with f5, and then even g5, and then try to attack the white king now, or get some play on the king side. So as you can see, the positions really carry a tremendous amount of interest. This is super exciting, super fun. And I would never be concerned about the computer showing a slight edge to white. It's always playable, always sensible. Now, going backwards, returning here. What I wanted to say as well is that, yeah, it's not clear what white should do. Like, he can just make some random move like bishop e3, but again then, just bishop e7 for instance. And again, c5, see, the thing is, black's plan is super obvious. Like 3 or 4 next moves are more or less, you know, by default, bishop e7, castling c5, knight c6. But for white, he really needs to take a lot of time making decisions. And you know, you can always argue, well, what if he just plays fast? And I mean, he can play fast, but then most likely he'll end up stuck like without plan or messing up somehow, because it's never easy to play a new position, which you have no idea about, and especially one where you need to make structural decisions, because, well, once you say push e5, or, you know, choose to take on c5, or choose to let black take, or choose to play c3, or choose to push f4, any structural decision is hugely responsible and hugely important. And of course, you cannot make good decisions like that if you are not well aware of the details of the positions. So, going back, this is a type of position I am very, very satisfied with. Now, let me try to show to you where some problems lie. So, actually, before we do that, let me show you a couple other things. Like, for example, say white can make some random move here like a4. But again, you just need to comprehend that it's not a problem. You can just play something like e6, something like d5, and, well, this move just kind of falls out of place. Later, for example, after, say, e5, knight d7 again, you just stick to the same plan. There's nothing to be worried about. Or, say, if white were to take, you would take back. Again, what is the move a4? What's the purpose? Like, what did it accomplish? Not only did it accomplish anything, but in fact I think it even made black's life easier, because now say the square on b4 is weaker. Now, for example, maybe some play over the c file is more reasonable. Now, if black ever wants to go a6, b5, he'll have a clear target, something to trade, something to, you know, use as a hook for his play. So, yeah, this is not a problem at all. For instance, if white made some other move, like, let's say, bishop c4, well, this would just beg for a 6 d5, really. And here I think it's totally fine to play 6, and for example, after, let's say, castling, to play d5. And the thing is, here, well, of course, if white takes, we take back again. White just ran into a tempo. But in fact, what I wanted to demonstrate, because I think at some points you might be facing choices like this. For example, after something like, let's say, bishop d3, you already have a choice. Do you want to go for the structure after d4, or do you want to wait? So in fact, both are absolutely okay, and this is a very important thing to be aware of. You can choose to take on e4, and I can already see how you can have any problems in a very typical structure, which arises in the French, in the Caracan, in the Scandinavian, in the Slav, where black already managed it to get his bishop outside of the pawn chain. No concerns whatsoever. Just get your pieces out, castle, knight f6, get c5 in. The bishop is good, no problems. But also, if you want to keep a more complicated position on the board, you can just make some move like bishop e7. And after, for example, white needs to make decisions. White could always play e5, you couldn't stop that anyway, right? He could have gone for it in some other variation, so there is no need to try to stop it right now. White can always take on d5, and again, if I were you, like if I was looking for a complicated position, I would try to make white make structural decisions, because basically, anyway, you need to be prepared to play positions when white takes on d5. You need to be prepared to play positions where white plays e5. And you need to be prepared to play positions after black takes on e4. So in fact, because you know all the three structures that typically arise, and white most likely doesn't know them as well as you, it makes perfect sense to me to simply wait and let white make a decision, because it's likely that at some point he'll just lose, his patience and he'll play like e5 or something, which is, I think, the most interesting structure that we're looking to get. So this is absolutely okay. But also, in such a position, it's absolutely okay to just push d5 right away. And say after bishop d3, again, you can just take and eventually play e6, or play e6 here. But it's just worth knowing that right here especially, there is no need to prepare d5, it can be achieved right now. But on the other hand, there is no smarter move than e6 anyway, at some point soon, so it makes sense to play e6 too. Now, after bishop g4, white can also play some move like bishop e3, for example, but again, you're not going to change the plan. You'll play e6, and when white does something, you'll play d5. So this is absolutely okay and absolutely understandable. Now, let's talk a little bit about problems. And in fact, white can try to pose problems here, I think, only in one way, which is to play h3, and after bishop h5, again, here, you can take on f3, but after queen f3, I don't really like this position that much. For example, if, say, d5, then white can play e5, not a big fan. Or white can play bishop d3, not necessarily that good either. Or black can try to play something like, say, e5, but again, he just got some pretty bad version of some Philidor. I don't like this. Or black can try to play a move like e6, but here again, well, eventually d5 will be played, and we really miss our bishop dearly in structures where white didn't commit to e5. So that's not gonna do. So we'll play bishop h5. And here, if white makes a move like bishop e2, again, you've been forgiven. You can breathe calmly. There are no problems at all. And again, the computer might still be showing a slight edge to white. However, those are the positions we had just discussed, and those are exactly the positions black is so keen to get. Now, the real problem here runs either queen e2 or g4 and then queen e2. And the reason why it's a problem is because after some move like e6, white's gonna try and play h4, trying to trap the bishop. While here, white does keep advantage objectively. However, again, the positions will be very complicated. So black can do two things. He can play h6 or h5. If h6, then I don't like the position after h5 and then g5. I think a position like this is super uncomfortable. Even though it's still possible to play it, and in fact there have been players like 2600 grandmasters, elite grandmasters even, who have tried to defend this. They would typically go bishop g8, and after, for example, some move like, let's say, bishop g2, they would try to continue with something like, let's say, queen b6 or knight d7, and claims that, okay, white created some weaknesses, he is very active, the bishop is bad, but, well, white committed to some structural concessions. But I don't really like this. I prefer fighting for space here with h5. Now, of course, if white, for example, were to take after bishop h5, you're just better, perhaps. White just created weaknesses for himself and got nothing in return. So, white's gonna play g5, and after knight to d7, white can now just continue with normal moves. Here, in fact, I think the best move could be bishop h3, but it's also possible to just make moves like, say, bishop f4 to start with, and to develop the bishop later. Well, for one, it doesn't really belong to g2, I think, because here, well, it's not doing all that much, especially after black gets to push d5 eventually. So the bishop really needs to be on h3, trying to put pressure over here, and possibly not obstructing the g file just in case. So in this position, for example, black can castle, Now, white can actually do a lot of things. White can castle short, but then I think we are actually doing okay. For example, here you can continue with such a move as just knight a6, and later you can choose to play d5, and yeah, again, say white does something, you go d5. I don't really get it why we should be uncomfortable, especially say e5. Well, this would be just a, Swiss cheese for white with so many holes. So, white would typically make some move, yeah, but actually, here comes a trap. If white makes some move, he could be even not just better, but already worse. Because with a very powerful move, bishop b4, you'll put pressure on the knight and on the pawn. And here, white has to either take on d5 or play e5, and then his position is just worse, because all of those moves proved to be just weakening. So white has to be very careful and play some move like a3. But then you go knight c7, for example. And let's say if white makes some move, you can take on e4 at the moment of your choosing, and then jump with the knight to d5, or you can just continue waiting, for example, rook c8. And here, in fact, it's not really clear, what white should be doing. For example, if white goes e5 again, this is just bad for him. Black's gonna crush him with c5. If white takes on d5, well, thanks a lot, we can take with the pawn, or we can say take with the knight, hit both. And this position, again, is just better for black, I think. White just created so many weaknesses on the light squares. So, white should make some waiting move as well. For example, he can play, I don't know, like, say, bishop g3 or like rook d2. And see, the thing is, like, I have pretty mixed feelings about this position, because for one, objectively, well, white should be better, right? White has more space, and black doesn't really have, threats or ways to get active. But on the other hand, white doesn't have a clear plan either, and in fact, if white ever gets tired of playing a complicated position with tension in the center and chooses to take on d5 or to play e5, black will immediately not just be fine, but even better, most likely. So, in fact, in a way I'm unhappy about this position because we're slightly worse, and because it's hard to get active. But in a way I'm also very happy because we got a fight, and white can just wait, but then most likely, well, we can offer a draw or something. Or white can start doing something himself. And if he does, he'll have to weaken his position, and that's exactly where we'll have chances. And the computer at first isn't very optimistic, especially after the moves h3 and g4. However, actually, as you analyze this position more and more and more, it starts understanding that the position is not simple at all. For example, there was one game which went a4. The white player was 2450, a strong international master, and as black, the black player was over 2600, Hismatulin, a very famous Russian grandmaster who's been a second of some top players. Black played d5, and now white castled, and black went for this very typical bishop b4. Now, as we said, if e5, then white will just simply be worse after c5, knight c6, all these holes, and an absolutely terrible bishop. In fact, what black did was a little premature, because white could have taken on d5, and now if cd5, then perhaps white can try some move like knight b5, and it's a little uncomfortable, actually. Now, say we can go knight c6, but then there is some c3, let's say bishop back, and maybe some bishop c7, or something, and somehow it's not very convenient, even though I really cannot say that black has too many problems either. But here white decided to continue with knight d2, and black immediately was absolutely okay. He went c5, takes, knight a2, he took, queen d4, knight b6. Then black got such a position where he had an isolated pawn. However, all of his pieces were super active. He had the two open or semi-open files, and most importantly, white had drastically weakened his kingside. And eventually, after some maneuvering, well, the game saw b3, black went rook e4, rook d4, decided to. He won a pawn. Here, the thing is, well, black's threatening to take on d3 and take on f4, so white kind of already lost a pawn. And perhaps white could have continued with a rook d1 or something, but then black can, for example, go d4, get his knight active via d5, come to c3, threaten this bishop. Maybe come to b4, the square on c2, the pawn on c2 is weak. Rook c8 would start threatening white as well at some point, especially, well, not now due to the bishop, but sometime soon. So the position would have been complicated. But yeah, white just gave up a pawn, and eventually, after some fight, black just went on to convert an endgame with an extra pawn. So as you can see, Well, this might seem weird in some way, right? Like, why look at a game or why just blunder it? Well, because the position is complicated. Because even, a Grandmaster level player is why just fell apart versus a strong opponent, couldn't hold the tension. So there is no reason why you need to really fear a position like this. I mean, first of all, White needs to play very carefully and very precisely and be quite knowledgeable to even get here. But even if he does, it's not like you're just, type of like plus +05 sort of thing where you're just waiting on the last ranks and waiting for your death or waiting for White to finally convert, his advantage. But it's a fight, it's a complicated game, it's totally okay. So, now let's go back a little bit. So, as I said, this plan with h3 and g4 is very strong, and it's also worth knowing that White can actually try to play this way by starting with queen e2 as well, and after, for example, e6 he would go g4, but then it's just a transposition. That is something we are ready for. So you just need to know that White has a bunch of options, but really none of them are threatening except for this h3, g4, queen e2, followed by h4, h5 trying to trap your bishop. However, I think if you look at these lines not through the lens of, hey, here's a computer, here's what it's saying, it's so obvious, I'm clearly worse. But if you look at these lines through the perspective of a player who most likely, as White, hadn't ever encountered this variation, and if he had, then he didn't, analyze it or forgot it because it happens once in like 100 games as White, you would understand that to first of all even think of h3, g4, and then h4, h5, and secondly, decide for it is by no means simple, is by no means obvious. So, if I were you, I would definitely not mind at all playing such a lane. But again, I wanted to present it honestly. I just want to be very clear and very blunt about what I'm showing. I don't like authors who come up with an objectively, suspicious line and present it as if it was a winning variation. I've refuted chess. This move 1g4 wins the game or something, Chess doesn't work like this. And we all know what the main lines are and what the best lines are. But the best lines and the main lines are not necessarily, while they're best maybe in terms of objectivity, they're not necessarily best in terms of being practical for club players, because you cannot really afford to spend hundreds of hours learning all the main theory. And such a line definitely allows you to get exactly what you need. It cuts to the chase, it gets the opponent out of book early, and it gets you an interesting fight where you can play for a win, where pieces stay on the board, and so on. So in my opinion, this is a really extremely interesting choice. Now, in this position, White can also try to make some other moves, such as, for example, f4, or for example, bishop e2, but they are not really going to be a part of this chapter. So at this point, we are going to say goodbye to each other, and I'll see you in the next video to keep researching those lines. I hope that your first impression about the Czech perk and openings that I'm really fascinated about in many ways has been extremely positive, just as mine, and I look forward to seeing you shortly after. Take care.